jazz music, card games, literature, Pokemon, women wearing pants, dancing, and Harry Potter. What do all these things have in common? At some point in history, someone out there called them degenerate. And as is usually the case, whenever something is seen as degenerating society, there's always someone out there trying to ban it. But just as there are people trying to ban it, there's also a counterculture pushing back by breaking the rules, ignoring public opinion, or simply enjoying the thing in private. People who do these taboo things, they're the ones society calls degenerates. When you look back at past moral panics that turned out to be nothing burgers, most people today would agree that those were moments of mass stupidity. Take Dungeons & Dragons, for example. In the 1980s, Dungeons & Dragons got swept up in the Satanic Panic, along with heavy metal, pop music, Ouija boards, Magic the Gathering, the Smurfs? Really? Care Bears? My Little Well, maybe they were right about that one. Patricia Pulling was an anti-occultist activist and mother whose son died by suicide, and she blamed Dungeons & Dragons for it. She lobbied for schools and libraries to restrict the game, and mainstream news outlets fueled the fire of D&D being an evil, satanic game with selective reporting. Similar to how the mainstream media today hypes up mass shootings or white supremacy. If you were a fan of D&D, Magic, or heavy metal back then, chances are you were a bit of an outsider. Someone who didn't quite fit in with the mainstream. Someone who might have even been called a degenerate. Today, though, nobody really cares. But if it weren't for those brave degenerates defying cultural norms, who knows? Maybe those things would still be considered degenerate today. The D&D example I just gave focused on more of a cultural vibe. Being a D&D player in the 80s would, at the very worst, get you weird glares around your small religious town. Degenerates whose actions will only get them ostracized from society are operating within fairly safe territory, all things considered. However, what about when there are laws put in place to restrict the degeneracy? In the case of D&D, there were some very minor attempts to legally restrict the game, but nothing ever came of those. However, the same thing cannot be said about dancing. Yes, you heard me right, I wasn't kidding at the beginning of the video. Dancing! In the late 19th century, many American cities, mostly small rural towns, had laws in place which made dancing a crime.
This is a good beat! Why aren't you dancing? Dancing is forbidden.
These laws were often rooted in religious or moral beliefs that dancing could lead to immorality, drunkenness, or other improper behaviors. In other words, they believed dancing was degenerate. If you were a degenerate dancer in the 19th century, you weren't just looking at being shunned by society, you were also an outlaw. Since most people don't want to lose their freedom, something being illegal is usually enough of a deterrence to keep them away from doing it. But what about those who aren't deterred? What about those who choose to keep being degenerates, even if they know it could get them in legal trouble? Look, I don't know about you guys, but I personally don't see any reason why dancing should be illegal. Unless you're trespassing on someone's private property, it's not violating anyone's rights, and thus doesn't violate the non-aggression principle. So if you ask me, any degenerate dancers who defied these unjust and liberty-infringing laws by dancing in public are fucking heroes to me. In fact, something like this did happen. If you've seen the movie Footloose, you might have a good idea of what this looked like. That movie is based on a real event that happened in Elmore City, Oklahoma, a town where dancing was banned since 1898 all the way up until 1979, when high school students fought to repeal the ban by announcing they were having a prom, which, due to the ban on dancing, would have been illegal. And it's thanks to those brave degenerates who engaged in their degenerate act of dancing that dancing is now legal in Elmore City, Oklahoma. Now let's fast forward to today. As I'm sure you've all heard, the UK recently passed the Online Safety Act, which requires adult websites to verify users' IDs to protect children. And this has dominoed into even non-adult websites asking for IDs, even in places where such laws don't even exist. Thankfully, the backlash against these measures has been pretty vocal, and I know it's not everyone, but a big part of the backlash is coming from gooners.
Goons? You are aware that we kids have appropriated the phrase goon and turned it into a positive? As in, what up my goon, or that car is totally gooned out.
Look, you could be the most religious and anti-porn person on the planet, but if you recognize that the ever-so-increasing mass surveillance state is a serious threat to our liberty, and that these kinds of laws are going to be used for censorship, then you should have the humility to recognize that no matter how degenerate you think gooners are, they have essentially become warriors, bravely resisting the dystopian mass surveillance state out of their sheer and utter non-compliance. It is thanks to gooners that VPN and Tor usage has skyrocketed across the UK. They may be degenerates, whose only reason for doing this is wanting to wank it in private. But they are also civil liberties warriors who are bravely fighting against the dystopian surveillance state. If the time ever comes when Western democracies raise their white flags and admit defeat under war on online privacy and free speech, you will have gooners to thank for that. So far throughout this video, I've mostly highlighted degeneracy that I personally don't have a problem with. But what if I told you that even acts of degeneracy which I'm against can be, in some weird sense, kinda based? Take, for example, drug usage. Now, in case you haven't realized it by now, yes, I am a libertarian, and I think that all drugs, yes, even cocaine and heroin, should be legal and available at Walgreens. Now, I take this position not because I endorse the usage of these drugs, but because natural rights theory says the government shouldn't infringe with private choices that don't harm others. In other words, drug usage doesn't violate the NAP. Now, contrary to popular belief, just because something doesn't violate the NAP doesn't mean you have to support it. Hard drug use is bad, and I wouldn't want to live in a society that accepts people overdosing on cocaine as normal, even if doing cocaine was legal. With that being said, cocaine is not legal, and I think it should be. I don't want anyone I care about to become a cocaine addict, but on the other hand, you could make a very good case that a cocaine addict who has no regard for the laws and chooses to consume cocaine, despite it being illegal, isn't just doing something stupid, he's also being kinda brave if you think about it. With his defiance to these anti-drug laws, he is essentially fighting against unjust laws that infringe on our liberty of bodily autonomy. Now, I want to make it very clear that I am not suggesting anyone go out there and start doing cocaine. That's not what I'm saying at all. Please don't do that, okay? All I'm saying is, even some things which I would consider to be bad and degenerate, things which I would take issue with, even those things can still be kind of based in a weird way. There is just one form of degeneracy which I don't defend, should be heavily scrutinized, and there's no weird loophole to make it sound based. And that would be degeneracy that violates the non-aggression principle. The reason I support drug legalization is because the consumption of drugs is an individual choice which only affects the individual who consumes the drugs. In other words, it doesn't violate the NAP. But what about degeneracy that does violate the NAP? What about, I don't know,
Rape, 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 rape.
Rape is correctly and understandably viewed as extremely degenerate. One of the most vile and disgusting acts a human being could possibly do. And I think most people kind of subconsciously understand the reason why. Think of the difference between a drug user and a rapist. The drug user is being degenerate, but his actions only cause harm to himself. A rapist, on the other hand, is being degenerate, but his actions directly cause harm to others, which means they violate the NAP. So I guess what I'm trying to say here is that when you apply the non-aggression principle to degeneracy, you realize that not all degeneracy is equal. So, what's the moral of the story here? Well, We've learned that people can be really fucking stupid, but we've also learned that, despite my better judgment, I can't help but to have an admiration for many so-called degenerates. And their never-ending quest to pursue their passions without the fear of the judgment of others, they, and they alone, end up being the culture warriors throughout history that we sometimes need to keep cultural mass stupidity in check, as well as to fight back against tyrannical and unjust laws that infringe on our natural rights. So, the next time that you're sitting on your front porch listening to Alice in Chains on Spotify, just remember that if it wasn't for some brave grunge kid in the 90s rebelling against the political correctness of his time by normalizing music with obscene and degenerate lyrical content, you wouldn't have that privilege.